Hello, my name is Ruth Silverman and I'm one of the Back on Track instructors. This week we're going to be covering preparing for exams. In contrast to our earlier lesson on study strategies, instead of focusing on how to study well before the exam, we're going to focus on the period immediately before and during the exam. I would like to acknowledge that the Student Learning Commons and SFU Burnaby campus is located on the traditional and ancestral and unceded Coast Salish lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, and Coquitlam nations. I asked my students at the beginning of this term, summer 2022, what sort of exams they were expecting. I got the answer for the most part that students are expecting to write exams in person for the most part this term. A little bit of online exams, and this is the first that I have heard, but some students have exams that are online, but they're all going to be doing them together in an exam room with their class. So I'm going to tailor most of this presentation to in-person exams. Much of the advice would apply to whichever format the exam is given in. And I might say a few things about online exams, especially online from home, because there's still a little bit of that going on. Today I'm going to give you a bit of a review of preparation strategies. Then I'll move on to some specifics about preparing for quantitative exams. Then I'll talk a bit about how to cope if you experience exam anxiety. And then I'll talk about writing exams, including how to manage your time on exams, how to succeed in multiple choice exams, essay and short answer exams, and open book and take-home exams. One of the first things to do when preparing to write an exam is to make sure you have all the accurate details about it. So the first preliminary thing to know, of course, is are you going to have to come into the campus to write it? Is it going to be on paper? Is it going to be online on campus? Or is it an online exam from home? You want to make sure you have accurate date, time, and place of the exam, or how to access an online exam. I have talked to so many students who have failed courses because one of those details was wrong. If it's an unfamiliar room or building, do a trial run getting there so that you know where it is, how to get there, how much time it'll take you to walk there before the date of the exam. You want to know the duration of the exam. You don't want to think it's a 3-hour exam and then midway through find out it's only 2 hours. And you want to know what format of questions you're going to be getting. That's because of preparation. You'll recall that one of the very best ways to prepare for an exam is to practice with questions. And the more alike the questions you practice with are as the questions on the exam, the better practice it will be. So if you know you have essay questions, that's what you should focus on in your practicing. What materials are allowed? That's a really important thing to know, so important that I've put it in red. If you bring in materials that are not allowed, you could be accused of cheating. So especially if it's an at-home exam, the proctor would be unlikely to notice right away that you have something that you're not allowed. So if it turns up later, then you could get in trouble. Whereas in an in-person exam, they might just tell you at the beginning to put the thing away that's not allowed. Also, you want to make sure that you bring in everything that is allowed. So in a lot of math courses, stats courses, that kind of thing, you might be allowed to bring in a page with formulas written on it so you don't have to memorize them. And wouldn't it be terrible to show up at an exam thinking that you'll have to know it from memory and find that all your classmates have a little piece of paper with the formulas? And finally, you want to know if you have to take the exam in order from the first to the last questions, or if you can skip around, return to some questions later if they're too difficult. On paper, you can pretty much always do the questions in the order that they're, whatever order that you want to. But in some online exams are set up so that you have to go through the questions in order, that you can't move to question 2 without putting an answer for question 1. And sometimes there's even timing attached to the questions, so you have like a minute to finish each question or something like that. So you really want to find out if that's going to be the case. It's not nearly as much an issue in in-person exams. So moving on to exam preparation, these are good whether it's an online or an in-person exam. If you remember, we talked about a study that was done in 2013 where they looked at 10 different study methods over 20 years of research with thousands of participants, and they found that the most effective study strategies for any exam you might be writing are distributed practice, which is studying in short amounts of time over a long span of time, so being very consistent in your studies rather than cramming, and practice testing, so making up questions or finding questions that are at the same level of difficulty roughly as you would expect on the exam and in the same format, and either like just anticipating them or answering them, or if it's an essay exam, maybe writing an outline for how you would answer them. So if you recall, you should be prepared not just for questions calling on you to remember material you learned, but for questions asking you to apply the material to new examples, to analyze material, so that might be like a compare and contrast question, or to evaluate material. And an example of evaluation question would be compare and contrast these 3 theories. Here is a brand new example. Explain which theory you think best explains the example, and tell me why. So those are kind of the level of difficulty that you should be preparing for with practice exams. Study groups are an excellent resource that we've also mentioned in the past. So if they are study groups from your same class, maybe talk to them about the different levels of questions and early on in the term enlist some people to make up practice questions at the levels of application, analysis, and evaluation, and share the questions and quiz each other. And that way you will find you will have questions to practice on that you haven't thought of yourself before. It's also good to just compare notes on what you think the professor's going to emphasize on the test, and also just to keep your motivation up and keep you feeling accountable for moving through the information. Teaching each other is also an excellent way to test your ability to explain concepts on exams. Even if you do not study with people from your class, if you're studying just with, say, your friends, as long as they're, well-disciplined, task-oriented friends who are not going to distract you, that can be very useful for motivation and for accountability to keep getting your work done as well. And related to distributed practice, if you're not cramming, it's much easier to get a good night's sleep the night before the exam and just to generally have a habit of being well rested. The average university-age student needs about 8 to 9 hours of sleep a night, and anything less, you're sabotaging yourself for your performance on the exam. So things like memory, problem-solving ability, concentration, those are all going to go out the window if you don't get a good night's sleep. And you need all of those things for an exam, so prioritize it. Sleep is particularly important for quantitative exams. I've heard this from math professors, that problem-solving ability is the first thing to go if you don't get a good night's sleep. Here are some other tips that math professors have given me over the years. So one is to review previous feedback that you received. So if you have homework returned to you, don't just look at the mark, pick it up, go through it. So professors have told stories about identifying an error in somebody's first homework assignment in the way that they approach a certain problem, and the student not looking at that feedback and repeating that error in subsequent homework assignments, in the midterm, and on the final exam. And if that happens, they can lose so many percent of their grades over the course of the term. Whereas if they had reviewed their previous feedback from the first assignment and looked at it, they would have addressed the issue and they would have just lost minimal marks for that. Interleaved practice and mixed problem sets without headings are an important point. If you just practice from, say, problems in your textbook, usually they are organized according to what type of problem it is. There's usually a heading that denotes what the type of problem is. So you don't have to just look at the problem and figure out what you need to do, what type of problem it is. So it's important to have mixed problem sets with all kinds of problems that you're working on, and know clues as to what type of problems they are, just like you get in an exam. It's important to practice identifying what type of problem it is and what you need to do. It's also important to practice with problems at all levels of difficulty. So apparently a lot of students say there's a problem set with 23 problems. They can do 20 of them, no issue, and they can't do 3. So they're like, well, I can do most of them. I'm going to do really well on the test. I could get something like 20 out of 23. But what they don't realize is that the 3 problems that are difficult are the ones that are more likely to show up on the test. So, the professor's not just going to give them easy problems over and over. Sometimes students feel confident with a certain type of easy problem, and they will just do many instances of the same type of problem. And that's not what's going to get you ready for the exam. You have to practice at all levels of difficulty. The best thing to do throughout the term is, if you get stuck on a problem, maybe take a break, go back to it, keep plugging away at it. If necessary, ask for help, but just ask for a hint to get you to the next stage. But either way, try things and work your way through it, because then you can get comfortable with the process of feeling discomfort about a problem and pushing through it. If you don't do that when it's a low stakes, no pressure kind of situation, you will see a problem like that on the test, or maybe more than one, and it'll really throw you, because not only can't you don't know how to do the difficult problem, but you don't even know how to work through the process of doing a difficult problem and how to work through your discomfort. So that often will trigger somebody's exam anxiety. They might go blank. They might have trouble solving even the problems they normally would be able to solve after that has happened. So you need to practice struggling through your problems well before the exam. And don't work backwards from the solution, because you won't have that option on the test. I've talked to so many students who are talking about, I'll ask them, well, what happened on your calculus course where you didn't do very well? And they'll say, oh, I was doing fine on the homework, but then on the test there were some trick problems that, I'd never seen before. And basically, there are very standard ways that professors use to disguise problems and make them look so much more difficult in order to throw students on exams. Make sure that students have a really deep understanding rather than just kind of memorizing a process. So these are some of the ways the professors make problems more difficult. And there is a handout that goes into much more detail about it on the Student Learning Commons website. It's also available in person at any of the Student Learning Commons at the Burnaby, Surrey, or Vancouver campus. So I talked a little bit about exam anxiety, just having your mind go blank when something triggers you, such as not being able to solve a difficult problem. This can really happen in any exam, and a lot of students report extreme anxiety that gets in their way when they're writing tests. So just some very basics. The more prepared you are, the less likely that is to happen. For many students, just being well prepared, having studied consistently over time, having anticipated what questions will be asked and practiced, that, for many students, that will pretty much take care of it. There are some students who will still experience anxiety even with preparation. But a lot of students think that they have, something clinical like exam anxiety, but really it's just a lack of preparation. And when you're not prepared, of course, you're going to feel nervous. Also keeping up healthy habits, like I mentioned, sleep. Also, a lot of students have a really good exercise routine, which reduces their stress. Sometimes they let that routine go during exams because they say that they're too busy. But that's precisely when you need to keep your healthy exercise routine, because you need that to energize you and bust your stress. Another thing that you can do to reduce your tendency to be anxious around exams is positive self-talk, or at least challenging the negative self-talk. Sending yourself messages like, you've got this. You've been asking yourself difficult questions from every section of the course, and you've been able to answer them. Why wouldn't you do well? Or even challenging negative thoughts you might have. Like if you're thinking, I'm going to fail, this is too much, I have no time to learn this. You could think of times in the past maybe when you thought you were going to fail, and what mark did you actually get on that test? Most people would have examples of times they thought they were going to fail and they got A's or B's, or at least they passed. If you have, very serious exam anxiety and it's still there despite doing all of these things, you might want to seek the help of a counselor. And health and counseling services, I would say, is the perfect place to go, because all of the counselors there are experienced working exclusively with university students. So they have treated exam anxiety many, many times. The other thing is, if it's connected to an anxiety disorder, you may be able to seek accommodations through the Center for Accessible Learning, such as having more time for an exam, writing an exam in an isolated place, or there may be other accommodations I'm not aware of. So I'm also giving you this short video, 7 Tips to Beat Exam Anxiety, to watch as well. And that video supplements the information that I've provided. A lot of what creates anxiety on exams is the fear of running out of time. And running out of time actually can cost people a lot of marks. So here are some important tips if you have a traditional sort of exam that you can approach in any order. So keeping the track of the time. At the beginning of the exam, looking through it, having a sense of how many marks the exam is worth, and doing a division with the number of marks and the amount of time, and figuring out how much time you have per point. So for, say, a 10-point question, how much time should you be spending maximum on it, leaving some time for review. And also, you might want to start with the easy questions and return to the more difficult questions. That can build your confidence, and it can also mean that if you run out of time, you're not leaving easy marks that you could have gotten on the table. You're leaving the questions that you may or may not have gotten marks for on the table. So, what about mixed format exams? Say you have some multiple choice and some essay or short answer questions on the same exam. Um, is there a preferred order where you would approach it that might save you some time? Take a minute to think about that. This is what I recommend, is to read but don't answer the essay questions or the short answer questions first. Just, to get a sense in your brain about what you're eventually going to have to answer. At this point, if you can choose to answer, say, 3 out of 5 questions, make a final decision that you don't change about which questions you're going to answer, and keep those questions in your mind. Then go on to the multiple choice questions. Because the reason I'm saying don't do the essay questions first is that there may be hints in the multiple choice questions that'll help you answer the essay questions later. So you're going through the multiple choice questions with the essay questions in the back of your mind, and you can notice where there's some sort of a hint that you want to file away or take a note of for the essay question later. So as you're going through multiple choice, answer the easy ones quickly. If there's ones that you can answer right away, just answer them. And skip the ones that you might have to puzzle over for a bit and put a mark next to them indicating that you're going to go back. Then go to the essay questions and approach those in the order from easy to most difficult and answer all of them. That's because the essay questions are worth a lot more marks than the multiple choice questions are individually, so you don't want to run out of time on the essay questions. And then go back to the trickier multiple choice questions. Spend maybe a short time puzzling over some of them, but still limit the time. And if worse comes to worse and you find you're in a situation with 1 minute left or something like that, the worst case scenario, if you don't lose marks for incorrect guesses, are just to guess or just randomly fill in bubbles. At worst, you're going to lose 1 mark, whereas if you miss essay questions, you could lose like 10 or 20 marks. So at this point, if you have an online exam where you can't approach questions in your preferred order, you might be feeling really, really frustrated. So there have been exams in the last few terms where there's a lot of multiple choice, and you have to answer each question as it appears on your screen, and a lot of the time they are timed and they will disappear after a certain amount of time. How do you prepare for those? It's more of a time management challenge for sure, because you can't start with the easy questions. But I would suggest that practice is even more important in that situation, and actually practicing under timed conditions. So if you are going to have a minute for each question, which is why you want to find out how long you're going to have for each question, then I guess you could practice with a minute timed for each question, but I would even better suggest practicing with maybe 45 seconds for each question, because then you'll be kind of over-prepared to go through very, very quickly. So I'd say, allow yourself maybe about 3/4 of the time that you would normally get when you're practicing. Another way to deal with that is just to be really proficient on the strategies that you need to do a good job with multiple choice questions. So for any multiple choice exam, knowing the strategies that will help you not be confused can be really important. So I have an example question here, and this question is taken from a handout from University of Toronto. And I'd like you just to take a minute to read this question and figure out like what would be your first step towards answering it. Like what process would you use? Okay, now that you've had a chance to form your own idea of how to go about answering this question, I will show you what I would do. And I would say that the first step is just to focus on the question stem. So if it's a paper exam, I probably would actually bring a piece of paper and cover up the options that are available and just focus on the actual question. And that prevents you from getting really stuck between, say, two options that are very, very similar. If you can actually figure out what the answer is before looking at the options, you are much less likely to get confused by very subtle differences. So you form your idea of an answer, or at least maybe you narrow it down. Maybe you know that I'm not sure which would be better for vision and which would be worse, but I know that that one of the ways would adjust more quickly than the other. So you can kind of narrow it down at least by looking at the question stem. And only then you look at the options and you might be able to pick out one or at least narrow it down to two. I would very strongly suggest that you go to the Student Learning Commons website under Learning and Studying and look at our strategies for multiple choice exams, and especially this University of Toronto handout if you have a tendency to find multiple choice exams difficult. What about short answer or essay questions? We talked about sticking with your initial choice of which ones you're going to answer if there is a choice. I didn't do that when I was a student and often lost a lot of time by jumping around between questions. We talked about answering them from easiest to most difficult, and bring a highlighter if it's a paper exam and highlight some key words. So if you highlight the word analyze, for example, that might continually remind you not just to dump down everything you know about the subject, but to break it into its component parts. Incidentally, a highlighter is very useful also with paper multiple choice tests because sometimes there are words like always or not that can make all the difference in those questions. So they are good things to highlight, particularly if you're going to be coming back to the question. So you want details and examples as well as general statements in your essay questions. And really remember that if a question is worth 5 marks, probably you want to be putting down 5 points for it. You want to write quickly as you're answering these types of questions, and don't edit yourself while you're writing because that will really, really slow you down. Professors are not very likely to be very picky about the grammar and the spelling and neatness so long as they can read it because they know you're having to write this very quickly. You might double space so that you can go back and correct it later if you have extra time, but it's really not a big deal. And for essay questions specifically, it's important to make an outline or a concept map, which is like a visual outline, before launching into writing. And that's going to, make sure that all your points are relevant, that you're not repeating yourself. It'll keep you organized. As well, sometimes you can hand in the outline with the exam, and if you haven't finished the essay, you ran out of time, you might at least be able to get part marks for additional points that are in your outline. And you want to be pretty quick. So you start off writing in paragraphs because obviously it's called an essay. But if you start to run out of time, then maybe switch to point form. Speaking of short answer and essay exams, open book exams tend to be in short answer essay format. They were very popular during remote learning when professors realized that it was hard to supervise what students writing an exam from home had in front of them. And even now, with the transition back to in-person exams, some professors have been converted to seeing the value of open book exams. You probably have experience writing them during remote learning, but we'll just recap some points. Sometimes students, especially those inexperienced with open book exams, think that they don't really need to study or prepare to the extent that they usually do because they can look things up. They think, I don't need to memorize things, I can just look it up in my book. And that is so wrong. You probably will realize that they're very time sensitive. Professors usually want to make them kind of long exams so that you can't just rely on looking up things that you don't really have the time to look up very much. And they also make the questions a lot more challenging than usual because they don't want people just to be able to answer from memory or answer from finding something in their books. So there would be even fewer memory questions than usual and much higher level questions requiring complex analysis, application, evaluation, new examples not seen before, that kind of thing. So you do want to practice and maybe time your practice. If you are allowed to bring in pretty much anything, you could keep the answers that you've written out as a way, an aid to answering questions. It might not be exactly the same question, but you might be able to use some passages or at least have some points there to remind you. But of course, if you are restricted to certain materials, you might not be allowed to bring in answers that you've practiced on. And a very important point is to avoid plagiarism. So for example, if you have participated in a study group, it's not cool to each split up the questions and write out answers for each other and share the answers and bring them in on an exam because it ultimately isn't your work. So you don't want to end up in a situation where you're copying answers that somebody else has written or parts of answers. The other thing about plagiarism is you want to find out if the professor is expecting you to cite your sources. Sometimes they won't because they know it's an exam and it's a timed situation. And certainly in an essay exam where it's closed book, you wouldn't have to cite your sources. But because it's open book, sometimes they do expect citations. So you want to find that out and you want to be able to cite if that is required. I've said this a couple of times before, but it bears repeating that you need to be 100% crystal clear on what materials you're allowed in an open book exam. If there's something in particular that you're not sure about, ask about that resource in advance in particular, because you really don't want to be accused of cheating for inadvertently bringing in something that you can't. Because you won't have much time to look things up, but you might need to occasionally look something up, you want to be well organized with your materials and know exactly where to find information. So you want to spend some time getting to know the indexes and tables of contents of your books, for example. You want to use post-it notes on your books, color coding, post-it notes on your notes and not just for the posted flags by themselves, but I used to use posted flags and actually like write keywords on the posted flags so that it would be very easy to flip to the right page, or use electronic equivalents if you are reading books electronically. Um, it might be worth, if it's a very content heavy topic or course, it might be worth actually making summaries of some of the lengthier sections of the course, or even the entire course if you can, and annotating the summaries in the same way with highlighting and posted flags to find things. You might want to summarize the course in a concept map, which is, kind of like a flow chart that connects different parts of the course and shows relationship. If you're a visual learner, having a very large concept map, maybe on a whiteboard if you're writing it from home or something, could be very useful for you to find things quickly. You might want to put certain information in a comparison chart for easy access. So the example on this slide is when you're supposed to be comparing works of literature on certain factors. That's very common as an essay question in English courses. Or say you're taking a psych course and you're supposed to compare various psychological theories, say theories of personality with Freud and Adler and Jung and a number of other theorists on different factors. For theory courses, you could probably summarize an entire course in a comparison chart, maybe made on Excel. So you want to have, take the effort to put the information in a form that is the easiest accessible for you. Take-home exam. It does not mean just any exam that you write at home. What it means usually is an open book exam that you have a number of days to complete. So the important thing is to work alone. Usually you can use whatever resources. Sometimes they're expecting you to look up additional resources that you might not have already had. But they don't want you to use the resources of talking to somebody else unless you're supposed to do it with a partner, which is pretty rare. The important thing is to be really organized in your time and your space when you're writing a take-home exam. So I had one once that was 3 days, and I had a part-time job. I made sure that I wasn't working on my part-time job those days. I made sure not to schedule social obligations, doctor's appointments. I wanted to make sure that I had the entirety of those 3 days to work on the exam. And I decided that I would prefer to write the exam in a computer lab at the university because I would have access to the library. Actually, it was a computer lab in the library, so that I'd have access in case I wanted to get any physical books or articles. Also, fewer distractions than at home. Another reason I chose the computer lab in the library is that the computer lab in my home department, whenever I would work there, I'd always run into friends and classmates and chat and everything. So I wanted to be somewhere where people wouldn't necessarily find me. So what I would do is I would go into the computer lab at about 9:30 or 10 every morning. I would work on the exam. I would take a lunch break. I would, take a walk or do something physical during my lunch break as well. I would go back, continue writing the exam till probably 5:30. And then I would go home and I would try not to think about it for the evening. I'd spend time with my family. I would get a solid 8 hours or so of sleep. And then I'd go back the next morning and start over at 9:30 or 10. And on the last day, I was actually able to end, I think, about 2:30. So, really plan to spend a ton of time on it each day, but also to preserve your balance and preserve your sleep schedule. So this is the Student Learning Commons homepage. I just wanted to show you how to find extra resources. So under this learning and studying orange rectangle, there's a whole bunch of learning resources, including the quantitative one I talked about, including the multiple choice resources, and they're easy to find if you go to this orange rectangle. And I also wanted to show you where it says find a workshop. You can scroll, you could attend live workshops as well that are listed there, but you can also scroll all the way down, and there's a link to recorded webinars. So if you wanted to see, any other webinars that we might have about exams or other learning or writing related topics, that's where you would find them. So, thank you, and all the best with your homework and questions. Bye.